Good afternoon, and welcome to Istanbul Innovation Days. My name is Arathi Krishnan, and it's my thrill to be here to lead our panel for today, talking about the future. Before we start, I want to make sure that I am acknowledging the land that I'm standing on. I'm here in New York. And I acknowledge that where I'm sat is located in the ancestral Lenape homelands, and I recognize the longstanding significance of these lands for Lenape nations past and present. It is my thrill to be here when we're talking about the future and what does it mean for the development paradigm. We wanted to make sure that we were understanding not just the tipping points of change, but also what it meant to unleash our imagination. What does it mean then to build institutional anti-fragility and to understand the signals of change, new areas that we might not have considered before? In fact, what are these alternatives that may actually be completely different from what we assume, that is different from the status quo, and how do we make them tangible? It is my great privilege to be facilitating this conversation with four amazing women. First off, we have Sushma Raman, who is the Executive Director of the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy and has over 2 decades of experience launching, scaling, and leading social justice and philanthropic programs. We also have Anab Jain, who is a designer, futurist, filmmaker, and educator. She is the co-founder and director of Superflux, a multidisciplinary design studio and lab that aims to make the uncertainties of our futures to more tangible choices today. We are also joined by Erin Coghlan-de Perez, who's a climate scientist at the Red Cross and Red Crescent Climate Center and also an associate professor at Tufts University. She's also the lead author for the upcoming 6th assessment report of the IPCC. And finally, we have Malika Outlish, who is part of the newly formed WHO Futures Unit in the Western Pacific. This unit was established to take forward leadership's vision to bring a long-term view in future pandemic response and to incorporate backcasting as a new way of working. So I want to start first with Sushma. Sushma, you wrote a fantastic book, The Coming Good Society, which challenges us to think about how human rights need to evolve with changing circumstances. Could you tell us about why you think this is important and bring it to the urgency of now?
Thank you so much, Aarti, to you and the organizers of this event. As you mentioned, Bill Schultz and I wrote a book last year called The Coming Good Society: Why New Realities Demand New Rights. And in this book, we argue that rights are not static or permanent, but that they evolve or change depending on changing norms and circumstances. So these existing rights might change over time, or in some cases, new rights might arise that few people had ever contemplated. So what new rights, for example, are needed if we understand gender to be non-binary, or if we think of nature as worthy of not just protection, but also rights? Emerging technologies require us to think of rights in new ways as well, whether through the power of surveillance technologies or the powerful scope and reach of new biotechnologies. Now, why do we believe this is important and why now? Approximately 70 years after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was really a milestone document and achievement in the world, we've made much progress and we can look back on that progress, but there's also much that remains to be done. And in many instances, we have seen rollbacks in these rights. So if we believe that rights and dignity are important, we must ensure that they adapt to a very rapidly changing world. Otherwise, they risk being irrelevant. To promote and preserve a good society and to look at the future horizon, we argue, we must rethink how familiar rights are constructed, and we might want to consider altogether brand new rights.
Thank you, Sushma. That's so interesting what you said. Through your research and work with the Harvard Carr Center, and you've talked about this a little bit before, but what do you see as new forms of rights that are emerging on the horizon or that we need to start to pay attention to?
Thank you so much. And I'll just mention before we get started with your question, a couple of brief points about the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. We're a human rights center at the Harvard Kennedy School. We have a wide range of events, programs, activities, and we welcome our viewers to join our newsletter where you can get notified of our programming. One body of work at the center focuses on the impact of technological advancements on rights, and I'll touch on that briefly in response to your question. So take, for example, the right to privacy. While this is really a well-established right grounded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and codified in more than 150 national constitutions, there are sweeping changes underway that threaten this right. So, for example, the proliferation of surveillance technologies, which are used not only by authoritarian or repressive governments or those with significant resources, but are widely used in democracies and emerging economies. The use of such technologies has significant implications for our right to privacy. Additionally, the commodification of our data by private companies. This allows them to track our every movement, behavior, action, preferences, our health, and a lot of our personal choices. And I do write about this in my book in terms of thinking about how do we reconceptualize thinking about the right to privacy in this era of surveillance. Another right we might think about in the context of UNDP and development is the right to live free of corruption. So we've often thought of corruption as an economic crime or a financial crime. It's been thought of as affecting the gross domestic product of a country. It's sometimes even been thought of in the public health context where, funds are siphoned off from a public health response effort that affects the health of individuals. But it's only more recently that we've thought about it in the human rights context, that the people who are the most vulnerable and dispossessed are often the ones who are most affected by corruption. And we may not think about that intuitively, but the reality is the vast majority of people who are the poor around the world are affected by what is called petty corruption, where you are forced to pay bribes to access basic public goods and services, or to just live your life free of harassment by the police or the landlord or other entities or individuals. And so a very large portion of your disposable income goes to paying off these bribes. But there's not just petty corruption that affects the poor and their rights. It's also grand corruption, which is basically corruption at the level of the nation's institutions, laws, and policies. And what occurs here is it's not just, again, the siphoning off of resources, but it's the changes in the way that the institutions and laws are developed and organized in order to benefit the wealthy and rich and powerful and those who are benefiting from these acts of corruption. So in the book, we argue that a right to live free of corruption will actually help people secure a range of rights, their civil political rights, as well as economic, social, and cultural rights.
I fully agree with what you're saying, and this idea of our rights evolving as needed with our times is so essential. In particular, I want to draw the link to digital futures, and whether you see new forms of digital rights needing to emerge as our futures more increasingly intersect with, one might argue, an inevitable digital age.
Yeah, so the right to privacy is an interesting one because people often think about it as a luxury or something that's a Western obsession or that is not necessarily relevant in the developing world. And actually what we're seeing is that countries around the world, India and China, of course, are developing these large-scale national identification systems. In India, it's called Aadhaar, and in China, there's the social credit score, as ways to kind of keep tabs on their citizens and to combine a range of information and data points on individuals, including biometric data, to put together a composite image of each and every individual. And this is happening around the world, largely fueled by Chinese technology. So I think that this is a central concern for human rights activists in the digital age as we think about how our future intersects with the digital future. Now, one interesting example is in our current day context in the United States, there are campaigns to have a moratorium or a ban on facial recognition technology. And these are really gaining momentum in the context of securing civil rights in the digital age, as we think of police and other entities who are using technology to track individuals and to arrest them, for example, at a Black Lives Matter protest. So I think the intersection between racial justice and digital rights is an area where we're seeing great innovation and potential for solidarities and cross-movement collaboration. In an article I wrote last year for Foreign Policy, I wrote about how technology can also be a tool for racial reckoning. The author and researcher Alyssa Richardson has spoken of the phenomenon of Black witnessing, whereby Black people use smartphones to capture, document, and live stream for the world to see the truth behind the modern day lynchings at the hands of police and armed vigilantes. And advocacy groups from the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, to the Electronic Frontier Foundation have likewise called for people to exercise their right to record. So I think you're going to see a great deal of innovation as social movements, and both in the analog world and in the digital world, think about how to advance progressive causes while also pushing back against some of the phenomena that are occurring in online platforms around hate speech and disinformation.
Of course, when we're talking about human rights, it's based in, as you rightly said earlier, or based on the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now, the UN Declaration of Human Rights is seen as something that is sacred, and it is very difficult to try and nudge into a different evolution of it, or even a different genesis of how we might think about it. Do you have any thoughts or ideas on how we might help shift the bedrock so that it does become more fit for our futures?
Yeah, so I believe strongly that change can happen from a variety of fronts. I'm a big believer in the power of people-fueled social movements, both at the local to the global stage, to really advance social, environmental, and economic justice. So these are movements that are tackling impunity and corruption, that are tackling, agribusinesses and deforestation, that are really, taking on some of the major inequality, inequity, disparity debates. And so I really believe that change can occur not just through the institutions of global governance and by nation states, but also by the power of social movements and grassroots organizations and their mobilization and communication to help push agendas and norms changes forward that can then in turn put pressure on political leaders and institutional leaders to consider expansions or reconfigurations of how laws and policies and programs are developed.
Anab, it is so thrilling to have you with us. Now, your work, you push for us to imagine different futures. Can you tell us why imagining different futures is important and how this could actually inform policy choices?
Sure. Thank you for the kind introduction. I think imagining the future is actually something we've always done as a species. Increasingly, what has happened is that idea of the future or the imagination of the future has been colonized by only certain specific visions or grand narratives that are created by specific groups of people or organizations or even nation states. And we are all sort of moving along that trajectory of the future that has been presented to us. And in our work, what we try and do is to explore other kinds of futures, that other alternatives, other possibilities that may or may not have been part of these grand narratives or these kind of what I call colonized ideas of the future, in order to present multiple other possibilities. And by doing so, perhaps catalyze people's imagination in suggesting that there are other alternatives, even though we feel like there are not. There are other alternatives out there, and we can find hopeful paths to move along those more um, just, plural, equitable futures.
You once wrote that perhaps mycelial arrangements might be what we need to navigate the complexities of our futures. Why did you say this? And can you describe what this means?
Sure. I have been increasingly drawn to mycelial kind of entangled networks because of our work for the last few years has focused a lot on climate change and climate crisis and global warming. And we have tried to find ways to um, translate something that feels so big and amorphous and intangible like climate change into something that is relatable, connectable to people in their everyday lives. And in this process of research and exploration, um, we ended up building a lot of food computers that grow inside people's homes, um, increasingly using principles of permaculture. So we got drawn to the idea of multiple different species living together in interdependence, which of course they do in many other spaces outside of the sort of more regimented anthropocentric worlds that we have created. And so the inspiration came through these explorations of interdependent multiple species. And the more I went into it, I was getting increasingly drawn to my kind of mycelial networks and the incredible power of the species that connect different that are connected underground and are symbiotically living with other species, providing nutrients to other species, um, in this extremely beautiful sense of kinship. And so I felt like this is a beautiful metaphor for us to think about as humanity, to not consider ourselves as the center of the universe or kind of this very anthropocentric centeredness, but to rather decenter our position and consider ourselves as companions and in kinship with all the other species. And what might be that kind of more collaborative network of um, giving and taking reciprocal network look like the mycelium do. So that's what prompted me to say that.
What do you say to the provocations that those that get to imagine the future tend to be a small privileged few, and therefore the outcomes of that imagination doesn't necessarily improve the social and economic needs of the many?
Thank you. No, that's a really interesting question. I would perhaps rephrase it by saying that not those who get to imagine the future, but those who get to make decisions about our futures are a few and small privileged group of people. I think everybody can imagines the future, imagines a more hopeful version of the future. I think, especially having done a bit of research, people who are worst affected by climate change are often hopeful more than others who are not, because without hope, they have nothing to hold on to quite often. And so I think that the the idea of imagining the future is not the remit or just in the possession of the very few. I think it is about how do we bring back this ability and this sense of agency around seeing the translation of our ideas around future into an actual uh, kind of future, into the real kind of fruitful. How do our ideas or imagination about the future come to fruition, more like it. And that's where I think sometimes some of the work we try and do is to try and many others as well, many others through film and writing and ethnography and anthropology, are all working in the way to create so many different perspectives and points of view, and to surface these alternatives is to say that there are many other ways of looking at the world, there are many other ways to imagine possible futures, And it is our imperative to use the tools and the skills that we have at our disposal to foreground and surface these alternate possibilities so that they become visible and they become unavoidable in the eyes of those who are making decisions about our collective futures.
In the push to imagine the future, what are some core and emerging principles that you feel we must integrate? And are there lessons that we can learn from just and equitable frames that we can use?
Wow, that's a big question. I wouldn't know exactly where to start. I suppose there are so many lessons, and I think we are all on a learning journey. So I would speak with humility about some of the things I have learned, with the acknowledgement that I'm on a journey and we are all on a journey to learn as much as we can and discover and explore. Um, I would say one of the things we first and foremost that we kind of hold dear is the idea that the future, this exercise of imagining different possible futures, is to not fall into the trap of predictions. And therefore, we are not interested in exploring futures that are about prediction, that are about this will happen in the future. On the contrary, we should consider the future as a possibility space, as a space that allows us to open up to many possible different alternatives. And this exercise, the other learning is that we are doing this quite often to not just take us into those futures, to imagine things we would not otherwise be able to imagine, but to then bring back into the present things we have reflected on in order to influence the actions we take today, the decisions we make today. Again, with the openness that things are constantly changing, things are constantly moving in ways that we will never fully understand. And so to acknowledge that it's the path that matters, it's the journey we take, and the openness with which we make that journey matters. One of the other things I suppose we've learned in this exploration is understanding plural contexts. So to truly understand that a future is a future from my point of view or our point of view, and the lived experience of that future will be different from someone else who lives in some other part of the world. And therefore, again, we bring that humility and therefore the responsibility of ensuring that we are not making hasty decisions in terms of policies, in terms of laws, in terms of product development that influence millions, if not billions, of people's lives. And we are aware that we need to be extremely adaptive, extremely open to change, and therefore open to the discomfort of not knowing exactly what's going to happen in order to better inform the future, if that makes sense.
Malika, thank you so much for joining us. I think it is absolutely fascinating that WHO has focused on building a team on futures and foresight. And as we see now with many more multilateral institutions and international organizations experimenting with these spaces, I'm curious about why WHO decided to do this and to embed it within its way of working. Is there a shift to long-term policy and programming for WHO that it is trying to achieve?
That's a very good question, and a question we get faced with a lot these days. But you're absolutely right. Institutionalizing foresight work and innovation at WHO is very much a part of a major operational shift towards long-term policy and programming, strategic planning, as well as leveraging new ways of working to improve population health and well-being. So through the course of WHO's work, what we realized is that there's a lot of existing research, knowledge, and data on sort of our thematic priorities. So that's communicable, non-communicable diseases, communicable diseases, health security threats, climate and environmental change. So there's a lot of data on these thematic priorities, but oftentimes there are gaps in terms of its translation into policy and that kind of programmatic support to countries, particularly in more unreached parts and populations of the world. So these complexities of current and future challenges require new and innovative ways of working. And this applies in particular to emerging issues that might require lifelong and non-health sector approaches, such as healthy aging, for example. So it was these sort of cross-cutting agendas, such as advancing health through attention to gender and equity, that call for new approaches to engage health programs and partners, ask these kind of critical questions, as well as encourage dialogue. So through the traditional areas of WHO work, we also wanted to embed innovation into these pillars. Now, when people think of innovation, they oftentimes think of high technology. But however, this does not need to be the case. The concept of innovation, extends far beyond technology to include the work of, let's say, social entrepreneurs and others on the ground. And this links closely to the idea of really working grounds up, which is a big part of this operational shift as well. So all this to say, innovation is not only something that trickles down from sort of wealthier to more modest settings or more affluent countries that can provide this kind of knowledge. Affluent countries can provide valuable lessons to other wealthier countries and to each other. Also, in seeking to apply innovation, we must always consider, of course, the social determinants of health and gender equities, and use innovation to reduce rather than entrench inequity. And that has sort of been the foundation of our work. So really, in a nutshell, what we're trying to achieve, specifically via foresight, futures, and other such innovative methods, is the enabling of strategic and multi-sectoral policy dialogue about countries' social, economic, technological, environmental changes and challenges, and their relationship with and impact on the future of health. This is done in order to develop sort of a long-term agenda for health systems transformation, with the ultimate aim being to reorient the health system from a single disease episode focus towards services that accompany people throughout their lives, of course, grounded in community-based primary healthcare.
In your work, and I know you've run multiple labs and different workshops, what trends and signals have you spotted in terms of future health concerns or pandemics that we ought to be paying attention to, or what are we missing?
Yeah, thanks, Arthi. As you rightfully mentioned, there's been a lot of these micro signals we've been talking about recently, and the future of health has been especially under the limelight because of the pandemic that we're talking about. So I'll get into a few of them. Perhaps there's a few micro signals that we can talk about in health that are perhaps indicative of broader trends that we ought to be paying attention to. So the first one that comes to mind is this huge sort of paradigm shift we're seeing in accountability and responsibility for health, in terms of moving from the private space to being more publicly owned. So what we're seeing across the board sort of is that everyone has a responsibility towards health now. There are no institutions or sectors that have not been impacted by the pandemic. Everyone has had to adapt, and as a consequence of this, there are new social contracts that are emerging between individuals and systems and institutions. So for example, there's now an increased expectation of and greater responsibility for individuals and communities to abide by social or non-pharmaceutical public health measures. In contrast to pre-COVID times, when regulation and enforcement of public health was primarily seen as being the responsibility of practitioners, public health practitioners, as well as policymakers. But now wearing a mask or getting a vaccine no longer just protects you, it also protects your fellow beings. It's a social responsibility now. Vaccination, from the same definition, can also be viewed as a social contract now, because individuals that choose to get vaccinated can be seen as being as helping maintain the social order and cohesion, and therefore they arguably abide by ethical considerations. So if vaccinated individuals were to show less care or concern to non-vaccinated individuals, particularly if they're not part of the same social group, this is one example of changing social contracts that could perhaps provide insights for countries on future interventions for vaccine uptakes. Another point is that the shift in responsibility has resulted in more people proactively seeking and pursuing information related to COVID. This is an indication of an increase in health-seeking behavior. So one question health institutions and governments could be asking is, how can we leverage this increase in health-seeking behavior to ensure improved health outcomes? For example, NCDs, non-communicable diseases, account for almost 70% of mortality globally. These are largely preventable. So is there a way that we can actually leverage this renewed focus on health-seeking behavior, coupled with the increase in individual responsibility towards behavioral risks, to facilitate better habits that account for this invisible epidemic of NCDs? So that's one. The second, perhaps more obvious microsignal would be the acceleration of technology and its impact on our existing systems. So not just the technological systems or the health systems, but also economic, education, and legal or regulatory mechanisms. So for instance, the rise of telehealth has meant that entire procedures can be completed entirely virtually without ever physically seeing a doctor or stepping into a clinic. While this arguably reduces costs for the patient, what does it mean in terms of liabilities? Health technologies and their effective use are intrinsically intertwined with trust. A lack of trust may impact the kind and the quality of content provided to institutions for sound decision-making. So as vulnerable populations are already at risk given the increasing digital divide, governments must therefore seek to reaffirm this trust in communication to their people by way of reiterating responsibility for health data management and privacy considerations. So the use of digital health and health technologies may offer opportunities for innovative health funding mechanisms as well. Over the course of the pandemic, we've also seen the use of crowdsourcing for research. We've seen telemedicines for diagnostics or point of care testing, machine learning and bots for infodemics and countering misinformation, etc. And these can really help provide a sustainable way to address increased healthcare demands and limited resources, and of course, the competing and impending fiscal crises that we will likely be seeing. A third major trend would be the future of healthcare workforce and the future of education and reskilling. And this is something that we're particularly thinking about at WHO as well, because statistics project a shortage of 18 million healthcare workers by 2030. And this was pre-COVID. Arguably, there's going to be a lot more needed now, given the pandemic's impact on population health and health systems, not only in terms of responding to the immediate needs, but also looking at things like excess mortality and longer term impacts on mental health because of lockdown, well-being, as well as domestic violence and things like that because of secondary or tertiary consequences of COVID. So knowing this, how do we start preparing and mitigating for this impending shortage? What can governments and health institutions do today? Some innovative examples have already been implemented globally. For example, in India, some villages have come up with the concept of quack doctors. So there are actually about 100,000, approximately 200,000 informed rural healthcare providers. And they provide the first line of healthcare in thousands of villages, which thereby reduces the burden on, let's say, more traditional qualified doctors. Other countries like Canada, Singapore, and the UAE have also implemented telehealth and mHealth to achieve similar objectives in terms of triaging patients. Of course, these are not bereft of challenges and risks or even controversies, but they can provide some practical examples how we can start thinking about fundamentally changing how we approach healthcare delivery and healthcare literacy, more importantly. Thank you.
What have you learned in setting up a futures team within WHO? What are the things that have gone well? What are the challenges? And what are the tensions that exist between trying to think and behave long term within what what we could arguably say are large, very bureaucratic organizations?
Thank you, Arti. There's a lot of lessons that can be learned from there. So I'll start with maybe a little bit of the narrower lessons learned more directly from our team and our work, and then branch out into the broader sort of challenges that we face. So in terms of lessons learned, there's multiple lessons that can be learned from our work over the past year and something of establishing a futures team. The first one would be really iterating the importance of contextualization and localization. We've seen a lot of work that has happened in the space tends to be a little bit top down. So really understanding country needs and priorities and tailoring our work and methods based on that has been our sort of our core mandate. And that's really what we come down to at the end of the day. So that involves keeping our key audience as well as our stakeholders in mind, which is really about meeting people, countries, and cities where they are. It isn't just about contextualizing more technical policies and programs, of course, which is a given, but also tailoring communication methods and outputs. Again, not only in terms of language, but also in terms of historical, sociocultural, metaphorical contexts. So using not only the traditional methods, which is arguably a very core part of our work, given it's a scientific organization. So not only traditional methods like reports and briefs, but also more creative outputs such as comic strips or graphic illustrations, which can help us appeal to diverse audiences, such as youth, because that's really a core of what we're trying to do, is also appeal to diversity of new and non-traditional partners and audiences. The second thing I would like to highlight is the importance of incremental change or nudging. Oftentimes, like, cultural change is fundamental to any kind of change, but oftentimes it's something that sounds quite lofty and it sounds quite fluffy and it sounds quite, kumbaya, but it is absolutely critical. And while it does sound that lofty, there are pragmatic ways in which this can be institutionalized. So some ways that we've tried to do this is, by institutionalizing a culture of innovation, which involves honoring your failures and learning from them, but also not being afraid of taking that extra leap of faith. Building an environment of trust and transparency, which of course also calls for the need for supportive and enabling environment. So this culture of innovation also involves identifying both successes, which is your quick wins, as well as your failures, and addressing them swiftly so as to keep momentum going. I do say this with a caveat because we recognize and we actively iterate that there is no standard definition of success within the very vast mandate that we work within. So also understanding that success can look quite different based on different contexts that we work within. The third thing is building an agile team with a diverse skill set, however, with very similar values. So we're a team of, we started off really small, but we're a team of biomedical engineers, epidemiologists, medical doctors, public administrators, sociologists, private sector innovators, and social entrepreneurs. So we really bring very, very diverse mindsets and diverse worldviews with which we look at certain things. So we have this culture where we constantly run things by each other, we challenge each other, we question each other, which does lead to a little bit of friction sometimes, but we deal with that. But this helps us really identify blind spots or gaps, which inevitably helps us in building a resilient product or service, because those are questions we're going to have to answer regardless. So it ends up being a much more stronger product or service because of this diversity. And although we have this need for diverse skill sets, of course, and that adds richness, shared core values also provide sort of the glue that helps bring teams together. It's that passion, the commitment to improving outcomes for the most vulnerable, persistence, and a sense of humor for when things get too heated is very important in keeping momentum and enabling resilience. So given that our work does not see immediate results sometimes. Another thing is just having people who are okay with ambiguity and uncertainty, given the dynamic nature of our work, where we oftentimes face competing priorities and deadlines. We're learning as we go. So we need people who understand that and, more importantly, are okay with that. In terms of just challenges that we faced at a broader scale, I would say the biggest one has been building a long-term mindset. The very important question of how do you enable political commitment to longer-term planning when we're literally firefighting a pandemic. So that kind of buy-in for political willingness is critical, but how do you enable that when, especially in the current circumstances? Linked to this is shorter-term electoral cycles, which can sometimes lend itself to a lack of ownership over the projects and the outcomes of it. Budgetary cycles and competing fiscal priorities, not only within health, but also between various departments and ministries. So this need to break down silos is oftentimes also a challenge. And of course, something that I think we're all facing is, this acceleration of the use of technology that we're all dealing with, as well as a widening digital gap. So ensuring access to everyone who needs to have access to this sort of information is a huge challenge, and probably will be for the years to come.
Malika, you and I have talked about this a bit, and the difference between doing futures and strategic foresight within the sector that we're in, and how it might be different to other sectors, and also from doing it from within institutions, being practitioners trying to drive a different way of thinking and being and doing within institutions. Can you tell me how, in your experience, how is this different, building this futures team from perhaps private sector futures teams?
Yeah, it's something that there's a lot of the cases that actually we learn from and we study from have been in the private sector. So, okay, so I'll address the first part, which are the key principles. I would say one of the biggest is the need for practitioners to be involved right from the conceptualization phase. If this doesn't happen, then there can be a significant disconnect between the strategy and the operationalization. Which oftentimes results in a top-down approach that doesn't end up meeting, the objectives in a pragmatic way. So really having the people who be on the grounds, who have experience with implementing this, with rolling out policies and rolling out the innovative policies that we're trying to implement, but having them involved right from the conceptualization get-go phase. The second thing is something I've touched upon previously, but really building a diverse team, diversity in terms of skill sets, geographical background, education background. Linked to this is, of course, having ongoing feedback loops and that culture of innovation that I alluded to. A third thing is communicating results and outputs frequently and continuously. This is absolutely critical because when we talk about strategic policy dialogue or futures work, or culture change, it's oftentimes very difficult to prove it or to show tangibility of it. So one way to do that is to communicate constantly, even if you're not complete, or even if the project is still very much at an ongoing phase, which it oftentimes is in development and especially in health. But keeping your key stakeholders involved in the process and where you're at in the process, including the sort of obstacles and roadblocks that you're facing, helps build credibility, and it really helps build ownership for where you're trying to achieve, what you're trying to achieve with this. And one of the other key tenets of future teams would be really partnerships and collaborations. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of richness that's already existing. And particularly as we face budget austerity currently and in the years to come, it's important to really feed into what's already there and to be able to improve that. So importance of partnerships and collaborations. Building onto that is probably partnerships and collaborations with the private sector, and I can talk about what's different in terms of multilateral institutions in the private sector. So one of the key, perhaps more obvious differences is the main objectives and the priorities that we come from. They may be a lot clearer in the private sector, but we in multilateral organizations oftentimes face multiple competing priorities because of the vast range of stakeholders we cater to, and the resulting complexities that are associated with that. So less clear objectives, which sometimes can be difficult in terms of delineating priorities. Linked to this is also financial uncertainties, as well as constraints of budgetary cycles that can oftentimes impede our operational effectiveness. Well, one of the things that is I think has been more critical, especially after the pandemic, that I would say is very different from the private sector, is really a lack of understanding of the limitations of international organizations and their powers. There's been a lot of dialogue over WHO's role in the crisis, the UN's role in the crisis, what could have been done, what could have been done more, what could have been done less. I'm not going to get into details, but I think there's a grave lack of understanding and awareness of the sort of regulatory or non-regulatory authority that WHO, the UN, and other such international organizations actually have. And this crisis has exposed those gaps and provided us with an opportunity to revisit decades-old multilateral agreements and just understand how those relationships ought to change, if they should change. But I think the first step would really be increasing awareness of those gaps.
Erin, we are so privileged that you're able to join us today. Can you tell us in very real terms what climate future's impacts might look like in different parts of the world for different groups of people?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my answer would be that it's very diverse. So what makes climate change often very difficult is that the impacts look very different in different places and on different populations. And so when we're talking about adaptation, we need to be very place specific and pay a lot of attention to local knowledge and understanding of how local food supply chains work and vulnerability of infrastructure and different things. So sort of highlighting some themes, I would say that extreme events are going to be really a key theme in the impacts of climate change going forward. So I think sometimes we think about climate change as gradual change of ocean levels or gradual change of temperature, but in reality, the climate goes up and down all the time. And so yes, while the temperature is going up slowly, it's bouncing from heat wave to normal day to heat wave to normal day. And so we're seeing lots and lots of extreme events that are going to be one of the most dangerous manifestations of climate change. Is an increase in intensity and frequency of extreme events in many places. So, heat waves, floods, droughts, stronger intensity storms, and you name it. There are many, many, many manifestations of this type of extreme event issue. In terms of those who are most impacted, what I would say is, again, a little bit of a common theme around the world is that the people who are most impacted by extreme events, but by long-term climate change, are people who don't have a lot of other options. So if you remember the famine in Somalia in 2011, this is probably a good example. People who owned livestock or who owned land and were farmers, they obviously were very impacted by the drought. But those, when you really look at who died, I mean, where do we see people really suffering the most horrific consequences? It was often people who were day laborers. So because they didn't have a lot of assets, they didn't have a lot of options, they couldn't sell their assets, they couldn't, they didn't have an alternative livelihood. They were already working for someone else. And so when that farm was unable to offer them employment, they didn't have any other choice. They didn't have any other backup. And that type of really deep vulnerability is where we often see some of the biggest impacts of extreme events and climate change around the world.
And what are some climate projections that development and humanitarian actors are just not paying enough attention to? So for example, what do you see as the projections around climate migration, and how might that intersect with development aid?
Yeah, it's a great question. So on migration, I think migration is a really complex issue, and certainly I'm sure everyone listening to this can appreciate that. And so the choice to migrate or to move depends a lot on your options. What options are available to you? Do you know someone in a particular location, you might be more likely to move there and stay with them, and then, see your options from there. You know, do you have the assets that enable you to migrate? And then what have you just experienced? So obviously experiencing, climate change and extreme events and major climate shocks absolutely influence people's decision to migrate. But in most cases, it's one factor among many, many, many other factors. I mean, conflict, supply chains, markets, networks. I mean, everything interacts in a really complex way for different populations all over the world. So we do see people move, of course, within their own country, and we do see people move across borders, and climate influences this, but it's not something a climate scientist can give an answer to often. When you look at these projections, I would encourage people to take them with a little bit of grain of salt, and we need development actors, and we need people to look at really case specific understanding of what's happening in different places, and how did these different drivers interact, and how might that influence people's choices, right? Because migration can often be like a seasonal choice that is a good adaptation to climate change. In some places, it could increase people's vulnerability. And so what does that look like? I think that definitely requires a deeper dive and a really interdisciplinary dive. In terms of other things that people are not talking about enough, my suggestion, number one, 100% suggestion would be heat waves. Heat waves are a silent disaster, right? You don't see, if you have a more intense cyclone, you have pictures of wind and rain and broken buildings and people outside, and it all happens with a lot of media coverage. And heat waves don't. People die quietly from heat waves in their own home or in hospitals. The people who die are often people who have underlying medical conditions. So maybe we don't notice as much, but then when you actually look at what happened after a heat wave, you realize that thousands and thousands of people suddenly died, and there were no big news stories, and there were no pictures. And this is happening more and more, and it's happening more and more around the world. So we're starting to see more attention for heat waves in places that do a good job counting deaths. But in many countries, our records for who is dying are more localized, and so it's not as obvious when we see these major impacts. So I would certainly say that heat waves require a lot more attention, and they are one of the most common effects of climate change that we're going to see happen in so many places around the world, that this really needs, I think, a lot more attention. And it's also one of the types of disasters that is easiest to help prevent loss of life, right? We have a lot of evidence on, drinking more water and different adaptations that will help, improve people's access to cool places. So, I would definitely recommend more work on heat waves.
One of the most fascinating pieces of work that the Climate Center does is around forecast-based financing. Can you talk to us about what this is and why it's important to build anticipatory decision-making? And what have been the challenges in trying to link that to link financing to predictive triggers?
Sure. Yeah. So forecast-based financing came about because we see, I'm a climate scientist by training. We see that there is a lot of information available. There's a lot of science available to help people anticipate events. We use weather forecasts all the time to understand when an extreme event is about to happen. But we see that people don't take enough early action to really help prevent all of the impacts that could be prevented, right? And so forecast-based financing is a response to that. Our hypothesis has two parts, right? So the hypothesis is that if people have a plan and if they have funding available based on the forecast, then they will do more and they will be able to better help avoid the impacts of these events that we can predict, right? So forecast-based financing does exactly that. We create a plan, we put aside a pot of money that's available based on the forecast of the event. You don't have to wait until suffering happens to get this money. And yeah, that's that's what we've been working on. And so we're doing this within the Red Cross movement, we're doing this in almost 30 countries around the world. Different Red Crescent societies are developing these plans, and many other organizations are doing the same. So this has become a really exciting movement towards anticipatory action. I would say, when you were asking about the challenges, I would say that really one of the biggest challenges that we face is not necessarily the forecast. Obviously, there are so many issues with the forecast and making sure you can have good accuracy in different places and all of that. But I would highlight another major issue is the capacity to take action. So if you are given 2 days warning about a massive flood, that's a lot of people that are in harm's way. And how can we mobilize as humanitarians or as government or as local institutions to do something very quickly over a large area? That's a very, very difficult question. And so this requires, the ability to act fast and the ability to act in a big region. And so building that capacity in our institutions, I think, is actually a major need, because you can have the forecast and you can have the money and you can have the intention, but if you can only reach 10 people, you can only evacuate 10 people, or if you can only, you can't give cash to everybody because they're not registered in your system, that's really preventing us from being able to do everything that we probably should be able to do.
Anticipatory action requires us to make decisions in different ways. It requires us to be even more anticipatory in our decision making. Can you give us an example of the types of decisions or questions that need to be considered when institutions or policies are trying to be more anticipatory?
Yeah. So this is a great question. And I think the value of early action is the action, right? So you could have the most beautiful forecast in the world, you could do everything right, but then if the action you're taking, the thing you're trying to do, doesn't help people, ultimately you are useless. So I think that this is a huge question that needs to be explored a little bit more. And what I would suggest is that we need to spend a little bit more time thinking through our assumptions about who is likely to be impacted. So who is really vulnerable, and then why, right? And then what could be done that would actually improve the situation or avoid the impact. So, sometimes it's pretty easy, right? If you evacuate someone and then they are not physically swept away by floodwaters, okay, and we can test that assumption and we have some pretty good understanding that might work. But a lot of our work is much more nuanced than that, right? We're trying to protect livelihoods. We're trying to help people avoid the destruction of their assets. And so, trying to avoid disease outbreaks and things like this. And so doing that is much more difficult and much more complicated. And so we might assume in some place that if we give chlorine tablets before a flood, that people will drink clean water and we will not see a cholera outbreak. But in reality, it could be that cholera is really caused not because of contaminated water, but because of hand washing and bathrooms and things like this. And so, we need to challenge our assumption that any sort of support that is being provided is actually helpful. And I think we need to really interrogate that and not assume that just because you reached a lot of people with a chlorine tablet that made any difference to their lives. So, same thing with cash, right? If you're going to give cash is often one of the best interventions, right? If you give people early cash, we were able to see in Bangladesh that this helped people who experienced a flood after they received the cash to weather the storm much, much better. But that's not always true, right? So you need to be really careful about local markets and what is appropriate in a particular location. And then how do you, I think there's a big question here for the localization agenda, right? So I'm speaking from more of like a very extreme event, external assistance is coming in to support. But there are smaller events that really need to rely on local actors. And even for the big events, it should be led by local systems, local supply chains. And so how do external actors and humanitarians support that and provide that support in advance of the disaster, as opposed to, normally you'd call in external assistance after the disaster when things are overwhelmed. But how can that external assistance come in and really support local systems? I think that's another major question that's facing us when we're looking at anticipatory action.
What a fantastic panel. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. In our work to understand the different futures that are hurtling towards us, it's not enough to just pay attention to the trends or to the issues that are big and loud, but to also the different ways in which this might actually take us off guard. And it's more than just how we respond externally to future shocks or future risks or future opportunities, but also then how we build different anticipatory capabilities within. Our panelists spoke of the different ways in which we can unleash our imagination, on ways in which we can pay attention to issues that are newly emerging that might shift the development paradigm, and how, in fact, and what is needed to build the type of capabilities and capacities. At UNDP, we take this approach very seriously, particularly in the RBAP region for where I'm based and where I work. Strategic foresight is increasingly linked to the way we want to design anticipatory policy and governance. And it is a very challenging approach to try and shift how we normally approach our decision making, how we normally approach policy making, and even the ideas and cultures that we need to build and cultivate. But we look forward to our journey. We look forward to building a new type of development futures for us all, ones that are just and flourishing for all people everywhere. And we look forward to our joined up efforts with everybody, with partners, with our stakeholders, with our constituents, with those whose voices matter the most, in order to understand how focusing on the long term, how focusing on future generations might shift how we think about the development choices we make today. And the question that underpins all of this for us is, what kind of ancestors do we want to be? Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to exploring this further over the next, over our futures. Thank you.